Thank you, Grace.
Hello.
Tristan, thank you so much for being here. And welcome everybody joining around the country and probably in some different countries as well. Tristan, I wanted to just start out by sort of talking about this trend that we're seeing of people leaving Silicon Valley, which I feel like you were maybe you started it. Maybe you were like the tipping point of people doing it. But why did you leave Silicon Valley? And do you think you would ever move back to California?
I'll start in reverse. No, it would require a few more zeros in order for me to do it. Look, there are multiple reasons why I left Silicon Valley. I was uh, specifically Black folks too, for kind of some of our leading brands. So for me, I had to think, where are our consumers, right? Our consumers are not in Palo Alto, California, right? And Atlanta, on a ratio basis, was kind of our largest city in the country. So it made a hell of a lot of sense. Atlanta is the second fastest growing city in the country. Atlanta's diversity is kind of way greater, cut in every single way relative to Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, it's the first and only place that I've ever lived that's gotten less diverse over time, right? Ethnically, class, et cetera. And that was problematic. It's flanked, at least here in Atlanta, 17 Fortune 500 companies with a burgeoning kind of startup community. I see in Atlanta what I saw in 2008 when I moved to Silicon Valley. You knew that there was an industry that was about to really pop off. I see that in Atlanta, but in every single industry: technology, media and entertainment, right? Again, with this kind of flanking of the Fortune 500s, it made a hell of a lot of sense professionally for those reasons. And then personally, look, the diversity imperative was very important for me. Silicon Valley to me changed, right? And I think that kind of going back on diversity was a big catalyst for that. I tell this story that really sticks out with me. I've kind of talked about this before. I went to go visit Atlanta with my family. We came back over a weekend, back to Palo Alto. I was taking my son to go pick up food for dinner. We walk into the grocery store, we walk back. My oldest son, he was 4 at the time. And as we're walking back, he says, "Daddy, in Atlanta is where all the Black people are. And in Palo Alto is where all the white people are," right? Now, he's 4 years old, and he was astute enough to recognize that. And that's when I knew that there was a problem. He had the good fortune to go to some of the best schools. And I had to reflect on the fact that none of his classmates looked like him. None of his teachers looked like him. None of the administrators where he worked looked like him. We want to certainly raise him in a more diverse environment. So the culmination of, I think, all those things really served as a real catalyst for me, not to mention cost of living, among other things, right? And I think it was the right choice at the right time, and I still remain convicted in it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I've lived here. I'm in Palo Alto. I'm in my garage in Palo Alto in the pandemic world, and I've been here for about 15 years. And it's been interesting to see. Obviously, I'm not a person of color, but you just and I wonder, like, I've seen a lot of change as well. I've seen a lot of different change as well over that time. I wonder if some of it too is like, just learning and evolving ourselves, and I think, you having kids puts a new perspective. I have 4 kids. Like, it puts a new lens on the world, right? And your priorities start to change, and maybe it goes from wow, hustling in a startup and doing that's the most important thing in the world to me. And then it's like, actually, like, taking care of my family is now the most important thing in the world to me. And that involves maybe my startup, of course, but actually there are other things too that are more important than just
totally. Like
being in the.
I'm older now. I have 2 kids now. Since I, left Silicon Valley, I'm like 10 years more married, right? I have led this company.
Congratulations.
Acquired, thank you. It's, I've had a wonderful privilege, wonderful career, but, I reflect back on my kind of 2008 experience, where to me, Silicon Valley was everything, right? I remember at the time, you go to Coupa Cafe, I know you know it, really well. The founders of Stripe, right? They were right next door when there were like 4 people at the company. Pinterest was right around the corner from my house, and there were fewer than 20 people at the company. Palantir is right down the street, and there was like this early energy that felt really, really great. And I think over time, that started to, for lack of a better phrase, kind of melt away as folks started to realize that you can create great companies anywhere. And I think COVID-19 and the pandemic is really making that clear, right? You can create great stuff from anywhere. And you're starting to see these new hubs of not only innovation, but entrepreneurship. It's really great. And it's great for the country. And it opened my eyes in ways that I wouldn't have done before.
So I grew up in Tampa, Florida, and I've been it's been amazing to see so many sort of elite tech people saying how much they love the tech scene in Florida. I always looked at Tampa as like the scam capital of the world, but now it's like, it's hot. It's hot. So give us the pitch for Atlanta. Like, I'm in a expensive, I'm in Palo Alto. I'm like, I've got all those issues you've described. Like, why should I move to Atlanta and start a business over moving to Texas or Florida or Salt Lake City or, somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, look, all those are great cities, so I can only speak for myself, right? And the things and the values and the things that are super important to me. Atlanta's a wonderfully progressive city. It has the business infrastructure here to, allow it to thrive. If you see everything that's going on, certainly in politics right now, you see that there's a sea change happening that feels really special. It feels catalytic in a lot of ways, right? Of the, let's say, 100 people that I meet here, 5 of them were born and raised here. So there's so many folks who are making a concerted effort and decision to take their families and kind of put them here. It's a big decision, right? And I'm starting to see that accelerate more and more, particularly throughout this pandemic. And for me, I mean, look, the cost of living arbitrage and the quality of life arbitrage, just the living arbitrage is very real. My wife and I owned a 2-bedroom condo in Palo Alto. We have a space that's much bigger than that with yards,
if you own that in Palo Alto, you were a real estate baron.
Yeah, that's right. It seems that way, right? And I got in like really early in doing that, and it just got out of control. Now it feels unfair, the amount of space, the cost of living arbitrage, the ability to hire, right? We had a lot of folks that were unwilling to come and work for us in Palo Alto for a number of reasons. Again, cost of living, but also diversity, et cetera. Atlanta, for all those reasons that I mentioned, I really do fundamentally believe, and I'm not kind of selling my book here, it's bearing fruit in that way. I think it's the most important city in the country, far and away.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you about along those lines of diversity and of, this sort of, as Steve Case calls it, the rise of the rest, both geographically and, also within, different ethnicities and races. And, I think a lot of people like myself with the protests and the sort of awareness around racial inequality that happened this past summer, we kind of all looked inside of ourselves. Hopefully people looked inside of themselves, say like, wow, I've been doing such a terrible job at creating inclusive space for particularly people in the Black community, the African American community. But this whole trend around remote work and not having to be in specific places, to me, seems like a huge opportunity for tech founders and entrepreneurs and decision makers to actually build a really, really inclusive space for the African American community in the United States. I wonder what you've seen in that regard, or what if I'm trying to figure out how I can be part of the solution and I'm in a position to hire people, what can I do, or how should I be thinking about creating a company and a culture that 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 Black people want to work at?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that there are a multitude of ways that I can answer it, and I'll try my best to be as linear as possible. I think number one, culture needs to be defined. I think the issue with a lot of folks when they use that word, they don't know how to define it. It was very important for me when I started the company to define it. I defined it in accordance to the values that I personally have that have kind of defined, my life and career up until this point, of which there are six: courage, inspiration, respect, judgment, wellness, loyalty. I've written them down. My team knows it. It's on our company website. We hire against those values. We rate folks kind of successes against them, et cetera. But it provides a definition. It provides a language for us to describe who we are, what we'll stand for, et cetera, right? So it's not about folks who are just going to laugh with each other all the time, right? It's folks that really adhere to these values in a very serious way. So that's one thing. I think more broadly, forget post George Floyd summer, even pre, like you need to really understand who you are and who you want to bring kind of within your company in a shared values kind of way. Because if those values aren't aligned, starting a company, building a company is hard enough, right? Like why make it more difficult? The thing with the pandemic, which I think you raised an interesting nuanced point, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's probably controversial. I'm actually excited for the pandemic and the work from home trend because it's going to create a new generation of culture-less companies, right? And I think that that's okay, right?
What do you mean by that?
So, there's a lot that comes with having to build a company where folks are in person. Many folks feeling the pressure of going with their colleagues to happy hour, right? Or, going to events that might make them less comfortable. The wonderful thing about values, every single type of person can fit within, right? You can have the loquacious folks, you can have the really quiet folks who just, kind of want to stay at home and that sort of thing. And all of that is totally okay. But it's going to relieve the burden of folks feeling like they have to fit into a subjective, arbitrary thing, right? That really isn't defined. And at the end of the day, our goal is to deliver value to the end users, right? And if we can focus and provide a platform for folks to not have to worry about the ancillary pressure that might have existed in a different way, great, right? So I'm like thinking about it every single day, right? Like how would something like this work? Is it going to work? But we're going to be forced to start to ask these questions, right? You and I are talking on the Zoom right now. I think folks have gotten like comfortable with like the video chat thing. But is that creating this ancillary pressure that folks don't want to feel, right? So we're going to have to really be thoughtful about what are the reasons why folks want to work for your company? What are the reasons that people want to work, right? What are the things they get excited about, and how do you focus their energies to that specifically?
Wonder what your perspective is on, when you're early in a company, and you've been at a bunch of companies at the earliest stages and created some, but like, in the beginning, you're kind of like just trying to get anybody to work with you. I mean, like anybody that like can function as a human being, you will take, because no one believes in what you're doing, and you're just trying to get some sort of energy and momentum. And when you add in, these elements of DEI, which are incredibly important as the company grows, like at the beginning, like it's basically, honestly, like I feel like it's like it's just like, are you willing? Like, please just help, And so how do I like tactically, functionally, like how can I, as an entrepreneur, like make these things important early on, but like not overwhelm the sort of
Yeah.
just the core things I have to do just to survive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Values is not a DEI thing. Values is just a who you are thing.
Sure,
And the wonderful
absolutely.
thing about values, when I think about courage, inspiration, respect, judgment, wellness, loyalty, it's not ethnicity specific. It's not gender specific. The folks who value those things are going to opt into it as long as you're being clear and transparent, right? So from the very beginning, the very beginning, with no real directness other than letting people know what our values are. We've been majority people of color companies since the very beginning, like overwhelming majority people of color, right? Black women in positions of leadership at my company, majority, right? Just because we've laid out kind of who we are, right? And folks opt into it. And then I think we try our best. We try our best to ensure that we have a scalable way for us to challenge ourselves, right? So when we interview you, we'll ask you leading questions to get at your courage and inspiration and respect, right? When we do your semi-annual, annual reviews, you're rated not only against, your quantitative goal attainment and qualitative too, but also your adherence to these values as well, right? So that starts to, create this cycle. So when I'm inside the room or outside of the room, we know what to look for. We know how to engage. We have the language, and we've never had to be as focused, quote unquote, on like this DEI thing, because that's who we've been, right? We set from the very beginning the things that we value and that matter. You combat that with some companies that will have a value that's like bias for action, right? Or like, work, right? Which, debatable, but, it's very masculine dominant, right? And you got to know what you're going to get, like with that, right? And I made a purposeful effort to, recognize what are the things that got me to the point that I, got to, so that I can actually know what to look for.
Yeah, and in terms of the values, I mean, your values are super powerful, and you came up with those very early on, and instituting them very early on. If I'm trying to figure out what I stand for, what my values are, what my values should be in my company, and I'm just starting it, and like I haven't done this before, where do I go? Like, what's the frameworks that you use to come up with those, or like, can I change them over time?
Yeah, it's a very hard thing. I'd imagine it's very, very hard to start and build a company if you kind of don't know who you are, right? You're kind of running like in circles, right, in a non-linear way. For me, it was very simple. I went to Starbucks on El Camino Real, sat down for 45 minutes and wrote them down. It did not take longer than that, right? And sometimes you just got to give yourself the time to determine and reflect, right? And I came up with those 6 in 45 minutes. And over time, right, as I get older, we talked about this progression, and as we get older, like I started with my definitions. I don't think my values have changed. It's just my definitions have gotten more precise, right? As folks continue to challenge, like, what do you mean by courage, right? Like, what do you mean when you say loyalty? And I just kind of listed those words, and you could just say loyalty. But for me, it's like earn loyalty, right? Have courage. So for me, over time, I've also figured out like what are those action verbs that like come before it to really more clearly and more precisely define what that means. The difference between earning loyalty and demanding loyalty, those are 2 very different things, right? So it's very important that over time you start to get more precision. And the last thing that I'd say, also somewhat controversial, I tell people that I will hire an asshole who shares my values before I hire a nice person who doesn't, right? Because the assholeness, quote unquote, that's management. I can manage that out, right? Or I can actually use the language of the values that we have to let that person know why that's unacceptable here at the company. But if we're not values aligned, it's very, very hard to work together.
I one of the things I've always been so impressed, just watching you or reading about the stuff that you're doing, was just how you managed to stand out and how you managed to create your own, just like a brand for yourself, and sort of like hustled into early at Foursquare and hustle into Twitter, and then sort of left to do your own thing. I think in a world where there's so much noise, it is so difficult to sort of have a personal identity or something, to be known for anything really. So I wonder, what types of advice or encouragement do you have to people who are trying to stand out, and maybe like trying to build a personal brand? Like where do I start with that? And what are the building blocks to creating something that people will know you for, or to be known for something?
And it's a great question, Eric. Recently, as I've been doing things like this over the past few weeks, I've gotten one question that I had never heard before, but for some reason, like folks have really started asking me this question. Maybe it's because I'm getting old, right? I don't know. But the question I always get is, hey, Tristan, if you can go back and offer your 20-year-old self some advice, like what would you offer, right? And I say two things. Number one, my 20-year-old self probably wouldn't listen, right?
Sure.
So something about having to go through it and like kind of feel yourself into it, I think is really important and critical. But second, I always say, I would tell my 20-year-old self not to follow your dreams. I think when people tell people to follow their dreams, I think it is the absolute worst advice. And here's why. Because, two reasons. Number one, sometimes dreams turn into nightmares and nobody ever wants to have that conversation. But second, and more important, is really the fact that, like, there are 7 billion people on the planet. Each of us has a very unique lived experience, right? Each of us within us has something that makes them the best person in the world to solve something. And a lot of us are embarrassed about it. And the kind of example that I would always give is, you might have a better, approach to, wiping your butt with toilet paper, right? But you might be embarrassed to do it, right? And that lived experience gets you there. But you know what? Somebody made toilet paper, right? And there was, unlocked a ton of value for that. And the reason I say that is, I came to Walker Company because I felt like I was uniquely positioned to do that thing. You talked about this idea of my creating my brand, right? I haven't tried to do it. I have been singularly focused on the thing that makes me uniquely positioned to articulate the thing that I care about. And that really centers around three things. Number one, the importance and the criticality of the demographic shift happening in this country, and the cultural influence of Black people in the world. Two, the importance of technology and its impact not only on companies, but also this demographic group too. And then lastly, I love great brands because they can be a force for good in the world. And every single thing that I've done really sits at the center of those three concentric circles. Name me one person on the planet whose lived experience can have them articulate really that narrative in as defined a way as that, right? Folks would be challenged to do it. And I think I would really encourage folks, instead of thinking about following your dreams, do the one thing that you are so uniquely positioned to do, right? And then you become a brand for that very specific thing in a way that nobody else can.
I think what's interesting about what you just said, other than it'll make a great tweet once this is over and I push it out, don't follow your dreams, is just this idea that you are unique. Everyone is unique. Everyone has value to add. And you've got to kind of identify that and tell that story. And that's going to be an interesting story because everybody has something.
Well, look,
if I understood you right.
The one, you're exactly right. The one thing that I learned throughout this experience, and I mean this very seriously, being a CEO sucks. Like, there's nothing interesting or glamorous about it. It's like the worst job in the world. But I can't see myself doing anything else. Like, I love the energy that has to go into, going through those thorny bushes to like find the glory, right? So knowing that this is a very, very hard job, starting something, building it, scaling it, why make it harder for yourself if you don't feel like you're the best person to do it? Because eventually somebody will be, and they'll come and eat your lunch, right? And that's a really, really hard thing to compete with.
Yeah, and it's hard to be the best at something, but you can kind of build it over time, right? You can. I don't
think that's hard at all. Like, I think if you are, if there's something unique that makes your lived experience like wholly unique, you're the best person in the world at that thing. So you already, like, all of us on this call is the best person in the world at something. The hard part is figuring that out.
Yeah, and then creating a space and an environment where you can spend significant amounts of time getting better and better and better at it.
And that's just living, right? Because it's your own lived experience, right? So the more you continue to live authentically, the better you're inevitably going to be, period.
I think you're I'm not saying any, this isn't some great insight, but what you did with Bevel is like it it felt so ahead of its time, in many ways, like just, whether it was, the customer demographics, whether it was the fact that you were able to get it funded, who funded it, all these things kind of put together. It felt like you were very much like just ahead of everyone else in terms of many of these ideas of people that are doing similar things now, and and not much easier to get funded now than when you worked on it. So I wonder, like, if I'm sitting here and I'm trying to figure out, like, what problem am I going to solve that's actually going to be something that people will need in the future? Like, how do you go about sort of evaluating problems or evaluating things that are ultimately worth your time or spending time on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it didn't start with like what other people needed. I started Double because I needed to solve my problem, and nobody else was doing it. You know what? I found out that 80% of other people who looked like me had the same problem. 30% of people who looked like me had the same problem. And you know what? This wasn't only unique to Double and Walker Company, but also my experience with Foursquare and Twitter. I joined Foursquare as like its first and a half employee, right? I was at Twitter when there were about fewer than 20 people at the company. People need to remember at those times, people did not think that those companies were going to succeed, right? I chose, and I really got excited about Twitter because I really thought that they would fundamentally change the communication. I got excited about Foursquare because it was really changing my interaction with place. The way I think about companies and my lived experience is if I've worked on those things for 2, 3 years, and even if they fail, I will have made my life better over those 2 or 3 years. And that goes back to this uniqueness of lived experience, right? And how kind of starting companies is hard and building companies is hard. Imagine if you're making your life better a little bit along the way. But I don't think, all too often, I think people start their companies by thinking about how you like worded the question, right? How can I do things for other, right? Whereas if you can focus on your own lived experience and do things for yourself, there are likely probably a lot of people who are like you, right? Who have that very similar type of problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. How many people are at Walker and Company now?
15.
Yeah. What's tell us, okay, so I think this is an interesting stage of like knowing or figuring out like some of these things. Like, is you start on the beginning, like you're just trying to build and you're just, frantically trying to get something to have momentum and to live, to be alive. Like, when you get to that stage or be a little bit beyond, you start to figure out like you've actually got to be a manager. You've actually got to like, you've got to help develop people. What are some of the things that you sort of subscribe to in terms of leading and building some of those early team members and sort of developing people even at a stage where you've still got to, you're probably a significant individual contributor still at that stage?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky. I was very fortunate to have a group of folks that I looked up to, right? So I think about like a Ben Horowitz, for example. He prepped me for the fact that this job would suck, right? Like I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't, or I mean, a lot of founders don't recognize how difficult it is to operate and manage. I would have a lot of founders come to my office, ask for advice, and they say, Tristan, I really want to start a company. And my first question back to them is, do you want to run it? And 0% of those people had an answer, right? And so the first way I'd kind of answer your question is recognize how difficult this is going to be, because it will be. And I don't want to kind of make this seem more glamorous. I think a lot of people do. This thing is really, really, really hard, even when you're successful, right? I even argue it might be even harder when you're successful. So first of all, know what you're getting yourself into and be honest about that, right? Secondly, once you're honest about that and you've mapped out what your values are, you know what your capacity for this kind of pain is, right? And once you're prepped and anchored in that way, right, and you know what your values are, now you know what to look for. The values are going to define everything that you do. It's going to define who you hire. It's going to define how you make decisions. It's going to define the products that you make and the products that you don't, right? And then the rest, like, it's hard for me to advise, how you're going to lead after that, because everyone's situation is markedly different. I think once you get to like the first time you have to terminate someone, or the first time you have to think about, you know, a reduction in force and layoffs, or the first time you have to think about taking a down round, like then you can ask like these targeted types of advice questions. For me, when I started, I never thought that I would, I never thought that I would have to get into the kind of termination, layoff, lawsuit, down round business, right? And I had to get into all of those things, right? But now I know what to look for, and you know how to advise through it if someone were to ask me about it. But general management, I think if you know who you are, you know what your values are, and you know what you're looking for, and it's based on your lived experience, it just makes it easier, right? And then you have to, I think, some part of that, going back to my 20-year-old self and him not listening, right? I think that's how it should be, right? Because sometimes you just have to go through it yourself.
Yeah, you know, as I think about that question, you know, the overwhelming thing I would say to myself is like, just relax, it's gonna work out. You know, like things are gonna happen. I think as entrepreneurs, we're so impatient. You know, we're like, we're constantly hoping this thing's gonna happen. Like I don't know. Even still, like I'm 11 years into being an entrepreneur. Like I still like try for these magical like home run type swings, and like the reality is like you can't, like there are no shortcuts. Like you have to live every phase. You have to do it. You said like you wouldn't have gotten to where you are if you hadn't lived those things. And I think I can really relate to that.
And
Um,
I would also add, you know why you're doing it. You know, at some point, you know, before I started the company, I was like, yeah, I want to build $1 billion business, right? I want to grow. I want to do it. Only to realize after raising all the money that that's not really what I want.
yeah.
You know, and by then it was too late, right? Because once you're on that path to growth, you build your company in a certain kind of way, right? So once you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, define what you want to get out of it. Some people start these to get rich. Some people do it to inspire. Some people, you know, do it to pass the time, you know, whatever it is, right? As long as you define what that is for yourself, there's a more defined path on getting there, right? It's really, really hard when you haven't defined that for yourself and you realize later that maybe that's not what you wanted in the first place.
And why are you doing it?
Oh, it's completely changed for me. I mean, I'll explain it, you know, with an example. And this is the best moment to ever happen to me at the company. You know, we were in Target. We got into Target. We started distribution there. This was in February of 2016. I didn't get to go see it in store until May of 2016. It was in Mountain View, California. I took my son, he was 2 at the time, put him in the cart, Mountain View. We went there. And we were in, you know, the leading part of the aisle, right? And you have like this beautiful packaging right under Gillette, which, you know, at least in our category for this audience that we were serving,
Big
hardly
deal.
ever happen, right? It's a huge
Yeah.
deal. So, you know, I wanted to experience that with him. It was my son's first time in like a kind of retail store context. You know, it's like this dad moment, right? So we walk in and I pass by it, but then I hear my son say, Dada, right? And he points.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, I was on one of the boxes. I was on a razor box and it was turned, inverted to the back where my picture was. And at that moment, it's really, really special for me for 2 reasons. Because number one, you know, it's his first time going down an aisle as like a Black boy, right? And this idea that his consumer needs can and should be respected is really, really powerful for me. And then second, the fact that his dad is on the box, right, makes him over time, he'll believe this, that he can be a producer too, right?
Mm.
So why do I do this, right? When I go back to that criticality of the demographic shift, the cultural inputs of Black folks, the importance of tech and great brands to unlock all of those things, right? Like I want to dedicate my life, right, to those things to create those target 2-year-old son dada moments, right? That is my mission, and I think I can do that uniquely well.
It's a great mission. That's an incredible story. Would you do it again? Will you do it again? Are you going to do it again?
Like
You
another
said,
company or like another like
yeah,
beauty
yeah.
company?
Like, would you be CEO of something else? You
I
said you
mean,
said
right
you.
now, I'll give
Not
you like
right now. Not right
yeah,
now.
yeah, I'll give you the answer that like people give when they're running for president. It's like, yeah, I'm focused on the business and like all this stuff. Right, I am. Like you know, we're 2 years in with Procter and Gamble. It was very important for me that we transition in the right way, set us up for success over the very, very long term, because that was our kind of compact with each other. over time, look, I mean, the things that I care about, I will continue to do things that sit at the center of those three concentric circles that I've mentioned, right? I mean, will I ever do another startup? Probably. I probably have one more in me, another company, I should say, versus
You're
like
young.
a pardon?
You're young, man. You're
Yeah,
young. You got
I
at
probably
least,
have one.
I mean, at
Yeah,
least
but
3 to 5.
I kid you not when I say this shit is hard, right? But I think I have one more in me, and I think I'd also like to, help entrepreneurs kind of know the right path and what to look out for. So I think about venture capital, that sort of thing. At some point, might make sense. But for me, at least on the company side, I my whole point of view has changed. Like I care
Mm,
100% about ownership, right?
mm.
The crazy outcomes and the dilution to get to the crazy outcomes, like I'm not interested in that. I find myself most jealous, right? Not of the folks who are IPOing with their technology companies. I actually find myself jealous of, the couple in Idaho running an HVAC business that they have 100% of, and they're generating like 10 million in revenue a year, right? Like they're hiring people that they love and respect. They're doing things for the community, and they're doing it profitably, and nobody knows about it. That to me is nirvana, right? And to me, ownership is freedom, right? And I want to never not feel freedom.
Well said. I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience here. So please submit those, and Grace is pulling those together. I just wanted to talk to you about, you sit on two really amazing boards at Shake Shack and Foot Locker. I have to start with a question from my 11-year-old, which is why does he never get any of the shoes and the drops that come out? That's the first thing in the app. Like,
Why
is there
don't I
some
get
way
them?
that if I email you, or if somehow maybe we got your phone number through this, like I get that from somebody and I just text you
I
at 7 a.m, like, is
I
there a
have
way for us to actually get them?
I've tried that
That's for
same
him. It's not
hustle.
me. It has nothing to do with me.
Look,
It's all the
look,
11-year-old.
as a person who has been shopping at that company since I was 9 years old, I've tried that same hustle. I've been asking the CEO, Dick Johnson, for the same kind of hustle, but he won't he won't let me get that same ahead of the line. So if I ever figure it out, you'll be the first person I call, but I doubt I'll ever figure it out.
Okay. Well, the infrared's behind me. I bought at Foot Locker 2009 in the parking lot at 6 a.m.
That's awesome.
So I guess maybe not winning the shoes, stinks, but it's better than waiting out in the cold and not winning the
That's right.
shoes anyways on Saturday morning. Again, like what you've done to be like what you've done to sort of spread yourself and to like have an impact across different companies. Like to me, honestly, it's so inspiring. I don't, we've met today, but I've just watched many of these things, and now this what you're doing at the board level now at these really important, incredible consumer companies. Like how does one line up for those things? Like how do those things come together? Like if I'm sitting here, I'm like 10 years from now, like I want to be on some boards companies. I want to have that kind of impact. Like what do I need to do to like tee those things up?
Before I answer that question, the thing I also need to make clear to the audience is my privilege, right? I mean, I'm a humble kid from Queens, New York, grew up in the projects and all that shit, but like the fact remains, I am a Stanford Graduate School of Business graduate who has founded a company, sold it to a Fortune 10 company, right? I went on a full ride to one of the top boarding schools in the country for high school, right? I have been equipped with the tools and the privilege that a lot of folks who either look like me and a lot of folks who don't get, right? So, my path to, the stuff that I've, very fortunate and blessed to have received is really a result of kind of the privilege building up on each other, right? So I want to make that clear because, a lot of it is like the hustle and the commitment and hard work. But a lot of it is the result of kind of the privileged opportunities that I've had. It's one thing to start a company. It's another thing to start a company sitting in Andreessen Horowitz, the venture capital firm, with Ben and Mark right upstairs, right? So that is critical. The other thing that I'd say, like Foot Locker is a great name, right? Like Shake Shack's a great name. But they sit at the center of those three concentric circles. Over 80% of their employees are people of color, right? For me, it's a wonderful frontline opportunity of economic empowerment and growth over time. Foot Locker has been a brand that I have associated myself with for as long as I can remember. I mean, it wasn't until I went through the board recruitment process that I realized they also own Foot Action and Champs in East Bay. And I told Dick, the CEO, I was like, I remember ordering in boarding school sneakers out of the East Bay with money.
East Bay, sure. I
with a
remember
money
it too.
order, right? So for me, like that authenticity, like Foot Locker also and Shake Shack kind of found me. Let me kind of speak a little bit about you know, how I got Foot Locker and Shake Shack, because they're slightly different. You know, Foot Locker really came out of my relationship, again, privilege, with a woman, Roz Brewer, who's the CEO at Starbucks. She used to run Sam's Club, one of my favorite people on the planet, wonderful woman. Sat down with her, I said, Roz, sold the company to Procter & Gamble, thinking about this public board thing. Do you think I'm ready? She said, yeah, like, you know, your narrative and approach to demographic shift, technology, and brand, spot on for a lot of these companies that are seeking it. She connected me to a recruiter who she had worked with in the past. I met with that recruiter on Friday. I met with that recruiter for an hour. At minute 59, the recruiter said, you know what, I might have an opportunity for you. I can't promise you anything because on Monday they're doing final round interviews. And she told me the name Foot Locker. And I had to maintain my composure because I just love the company. Over the weekend, she called me. She said, the lead director is willing to meet you. I flew out to Cincinnati to meet her on that Tuesday. I spoke to the head of nominating governance committee that Thursday. I met with the CEO the following week. And 2 weeks later, they asked me to join the board. Shake Shack, when I was, that day that I was meeting with the CEO at Foot Locker, we were walking, looking at stores, and I'm interviewing. I had an interview at Etsy, like a fireside one-on-one chat, just like this, Etsy in Brooklyn. Josh Silverman, the CEO, was interviewing me. Before he went on, you know, we were talking about things that he was doing. He was like, I'm excited about kind of my board work at Shake Shack. I was telling him about Foot Locker. And I looked at him and said, oh, I want to join the board of Shake Shack, right? And I said it somewhat facetiously, but kind of seriously. You know, the following day, he connected me to Randy, the CEO. A couple months later, like, we met, and then it became a board process. So let me kind of wrap this all in a bow. Number one, sometimes you just gotta, you don't get what you don't ask for, right? But the reason I was able to get what I asked for, right, is because I have worked so diligently on that narrative, right, where companies were able to find me as well, right? So in the interview process, yes, they were interviewing me, but I was also interviewing them, right? And do our values also align? Last thing I'd say, and I'll shut up. A lot of folks say they want to join boards, but have no idea what that even means. So sometimes what I recommend to folks is, you know, acquire the governance experience you need. There are a lot of not-for-profits that need help, right? With board members who want to do it. You learn what you need to learn. As you're starting your companies, take governance seriously. Board meetings seem annoying, right? Like, I got to make this slide deck every quarter, blah, blah, blah. But it sets you up to understand why governance matters and why some of the better companies have the best governance. So I had taken that seriously well before I had even thought about, you know, joining public boards.
As we get to this is my last question for you, and that was a great, thank you for sharing that. As we get to the end of the year, I wonder what your process is for preparing for the new year, setting goals, reflecting on what's happened over the previous year, and any advice you have for people watching on what they can do to really maximize 2021.
Yeah, it's interesting, particularly sitting on the boards that I do and kind of living in the privilege that I have, right? Like, you have to reconcile with the fact that there are a lot of people suffering in this country. It makes me really, really mad, really, really mad, because it doesn't have to be that way. So for me, like, when I kind of think about this stuff, I'm sorry if you hear my kids in the background. When I think about this stuff, I try to think a little bit about, all right, what are the things that are going to keep me happy and authentic for the next stage of my life? But also, how can I ensure that I'm giving back, much in the same way that I have been over the past, let's say, decade or so. So for me, and this is, I try and make my life as simple as possible. I think about frameworks and tools, et cetera. And the only thing that I'd offer you is each year, you know, ask yourself, am I doing what I am authentically capable of doing? And then two, are the people that I'm working with, the things that I'm doing, matching the values that I've set for myself? right? Um, those are the only things that really matter. You might find that the job that you're at, the company that you're starting, right, is no longer relevant on each of those things, right? And life is way too short, right, to be unhappy. And if you are in the position where you can actually honestly ask and answer that question of yourself, and you're in the position where you're getting the income to survive month over month, right? And I mean that very poignantly, because it's really, really important that your livelihood is maintained in a way that will give you the sustainability and your mental health to do it. If you can answer that for yourself, then do it, right? Like really do it. And what better time when everything is resetting? Literally everything in the world is resetting right now to chase the thing that you feel authentically committed and capable of doing that matches your values.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for being here with us and taking the time to share this with our community. Grace, I know there's a bunch of questions. Fire away.
Yeah. A lot of great conversation going on in the chat. I'm sure you guys aren't looking at it, but people helping people, and it's awesome to watch. Z has a question about how it is, or how it was, running a young business while also starting a family. And I think both of you have experience with this, but how do you balance those two things?
Yeah. So I'd answer it two ways. I mentioned Roz Brewer a little earlier. When she was running Sam's Club, I asked her to come to the office to inspire the team. And we had a conversation during the Q&A. One of my colleagues raised her hand and she said, "Roz, can you have it all?" And her answer really stuck with me. She said, "Yes, just not at the same time." Right? Which was, it's made me think about that answer even to this day. And the way I think about it is, I've never really been pressured by the stresses of work, compromise with family, et cetera. To me, there are three things that I care most about: my faith, my family, and my work. Literally in that order. And nothing else can fit within that time. There are only 24 hours in a day. There are other people that can help, right? But I really need to focus my time, my effort, and my energy to those three things if I care to focus. And this is why I try and work so much on frameworks, right? Like, what are the things that I care about? What are the values that I have? How am I going to actually make these decisions? And once you have these sorts of frameworks, you give yourself back a lot of time. There are going to be a lot of friends who no longer have to be in your life. There are going to be a lot of decisions you no longer have to make. There are going to be a lot of kind of work-related opportunities that just aren't worth the time, right? So for me, I have never felt stretched throughout this entire time because I have prioritized things so efficiently.
That's a great answer. And I think I've been reflecting a lot with my family, especially on this time, these last 8 or so months, about how everything has become so simplified for a lot of people, where like you only can do a couple things given that everything's shut down, and people have realized what really are those simple, important things in your life. And I think family ends up being a huge one of them. And then your whatever work you can do from your house is kind of the next one down. So okay, let's see. From John Johnson, how do other leaders like yourself lead the next generation of creatives? What is the most important thing that we should be aware of?
Oh, that's a great question. The youth is the future, right? Literally and figuratively. The thing you should be aware of, I go back to that 20-year-old advice thing. Like, don't listen. I know it sounds like crazy advice, but the crazy ideas come from the best ideas come from the folks who didn't listen, right? And let me kind of also anchor that for a second. You should not listen if you fundamentally feel that you're the best person to do that thing, right? If you're not the best person to do that thing, then maybe you should probably listen, right? Because when you are the best person to do that thing, you have the most unique point of view in the room, right? And sometimes people have to catch up to that point of view, right? So the first thing that I would assess is, are you, as a creative, right, really doing the thing that you should be doing, right? Progress isn't a one-lane highway, right? Like, there are many ways to kind of support kind of your passion for creativity, right, et cetera. So is the one thing that you're doing specifically day to day the best way that you can contribute based on your lived experience, right? If so, right, go, right? And there'll be a lot of people that are trying to get your advice, but know that you're going to have to go through some of the pain yourself to find the breakthrough, right? Like, there's no beaten path to glorious height. Like, I really do fundamentally believe that. So, you know, you got to feel it though. You got to honestly take stock. And so few people do this, right? Take the time to think about whether or not, you know, this is the thing you should be doing that you're going to be spending the rest of your life.
I think that also answers Marcy's question about a startup always sprouts from an idea. How do you know which idea to choose? And I think that that answer pretty much covers that as well. Troy was wondering, how can I start a culture in a 22-year-old SME, and how long will it usually take for people to take up the culture? I assume he's 22, but a question about like the length of time that those things take.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be immediate if you have clearly defined what it is, right? I mean, people interview at companies. You should help them know what they're getting themselves into. If you've done a good job at that, there's no reason to have to teach what the culture needs to be, right? Now, naturally, like, folks will come into a company, again, some people are more talkative than others, right? You gotta kind of, you know, you gotta read the room a little bit, right? And that takes like a few months. People start to understand kind of work styles, et cetera. But if you've kind of clearly articulated and defined what your culture is, like through your values, it should be immediate, right? It should happen in the interview process, frankly. And if there's any problem with that, or if you feel like it's taking too long, then perhaps you probably haven't clearly defined it enough.
Great answer. Okay, well, we'll end on this one. Perry Johnson was wondering, how did you get in with Andreessen and Horowitz? Maybe there's like a fun story there, or is it?
Oh no, they were on the board of Foursquare, so it was
Okay.
right at the right time. And you know, when I told Dennis, the founder, that I was, you know, thinking about moving on, Ben Horowitz, who's on the board, called me into his office, and the rest is history.
There you go. Simple. Derek, do you have anything else to wrap up with?
No, just thanks so much, Tristan, for being here. We know your time's precious. Actually, another thing that probably isn't a public thing that people know a lot about you, but because we've tried to get you to speak like 20 times at SparkRun over the years, but you're militant about what you do at events. And I actually, like, as somebody that runs a lot of events, or our team does, like, I don't speak at a lot of events either, honestly. And so it just said to me always, you know, sometimes we're like, come on, how are we going to get this guy to speak? But it always said to me, like, you're very clear and precise about what mattered to you. And it was like, I'm going to work, I'm going to build my company, and I'm going to, like, be with my family. And I think that is something that would benefit a lot of people, including myself, if we, you know, sort of made sure and prioritize those things. So grateful to finally get you, but also really respect what you've done, and, you know, and how you prioritize your time and your life, and wish you a lot of luck in 2021. Thanks for being here.
No, thank you, man. I appreciate that, and it certainly resonates. I mean, one of the kind of most important parts of this for me is to help people recognize that it's not only me, right? There are so many folks who look like me doing so many cool things.
You're not a self-made man.
Oh boy, that's a whole another fireside. But like I think you know, there were a lot of folks, media, press, otherwise, that were lazy, right? And I wanted to really encourage folks that there are great folks out there doing great work. So look, I mean, I appreciate, and I'm thankful for you even just thinking of me and asking me, and I'm hopeful that this was helpful and productive. But you know, I'd love to do it again.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tristan. Happy holidays. Hope your family's well. We'll talk to you soon.
Happy holidays, guys. See ya.
Bye.